Hello everyone, this is Danielle, the Flutterfly, and you're watching my Beginning Flutter series. Today we're going to talk about the column widget and row. They're basically the same thing. Let's see how useful they are. Come on inside with me. In Flutter they say, everything's a widget, and that's basically true. And the general pattern of how you modify a widget is you wrap it in another widget. So for example, I can put that welcome back in a center, and it puts it in the center of the screen. I could further go and wrap it with a rotated box. And inside of that, I could say that I have quarter turns of 3. When I say that, you will see it turns it sideways like that. That's great. However, if you think about it, we need ways to put more than one widget on a screen, and that's where the column comes in. Okay, right here I have a simple text widget, but if we wrap it with a column, which holds a children, not child, so that means that it has more than one possible children. So I can come in here and I could say text, do not worry, Dorian is here. And if I go and save that, we will see that it does in fact put that there. Now, here's something interesting, and we're going to talk about it in a second, but notice how the I am a lonely text widget is centered, but the whole column itself is not centered. And that's kind of interesting. And we'll look at that again in just a second. However, I want to keep going. Let's add a Flutter logo. When I save that, you will see that's right there in the center. But maybe I want to put some text to the right of that. So let's wrap that in a row. Same idea. It's the same, it's got children. And now I go in here and I could add another text widget. And we could just say, I love Dash. And you'll see that puts that right there. But maybe I wanted to have a column that had that, and you will see where this is going. So I can wrap that with a column. And I could add another text. It says, very much. And when I do that, it adds that there. Now, we have I'm a lonely text and do not worry, Dorian is here is now centered in the entire screen width-wise, but the Flutter logo and the I love Dash very much are the far left. Why is that? Let's start talking about some alignment. You will see I have drawn out a column here with 3 widgets in it. Now, how they are laid out depends upon 3 main variables. So we have the mainAxisSize. That tells us whether it's going to be the full height or whether it's only going to fit the amount it needs to. We have the mainAxisAlignment. That tells us, is it going to start at the top? Is it going to spread them evenly? Is it going to center them? Things like that. And then we have the cross-axis alignment. Does it start at the beginning, at the end, in the middle? How does that work? And we also have some left to right and directionality, and we also have top to bottom directionality that we can define. Now, let me grab the row one. Hold on a second. Oh yeah, it's the same thing. We have the same 3 variables, mainAxisSize, mainAxisAlignment, and cross-axis alignment. In fact, these actually derive from the same flex widget, and it's possible to build one without knowing at the time you build it whether it needs to be horizontal or vertical, and you can actually decide that in the build method itself. All right, let's get back into the code. Okay, now let's talk about mainAxisSize. What that means is it means in the case of a column, it's how much height is the column going to take up. In the case of a row, of course, it's width. If we take a look at the Flutter inspector, this is probably the official way to take a look, and we can see that the column takes up the whole height. And that's probably pretty good to learn. It's worth doing, but for me, I've got a little trick I'd like to show you. So if I go over here, we could wrap this with a container. And inside the container, I could say color, and we can make it yellow. And when I say that, you will see that it takes up the whole height, and that makes it very obvious what's going on. This behavior is controlled by the mainAxisSize parameter, and the default for this is mainAxisSize max. Now, sometimes it behaves a little bit differently. when you start nesting these. But the outermost one will always be max by default. But of course, we can change that. So this is saved with max, but if I go over here and do min, what you will see is that it now only takes up the size that it needed to. This is important if I wanted to align this, if I wanted to make it part of a stack, things like that. On the other hand, max is useful when I want to space things and control how things are laid out, but take up more of the screen. Once again, the main axis is the direction we're stacking elements. So in the case of a column, it is vertical. In the case of a row, it would be horizontal. And the other direction is the cross axis. So one thing that's very obvious by putting the background in here is that the cross axis size is the size of the biggest element that's in here. If we had one that took up the full width, it would be the full width, but we do not. Now, this will matter when you go to do things like center it. So if I wanted to center this text in the middle of the screen, I would have to both center the column and then make sure that the text is centered inside the column. And we'll start covering that in the cross-axis alignment. Okay, the cross-axis is the axis that goes opposite of the main axis. You'll remember the main axis is the direction that we're displaying the element. So in the case of a column, that's vertically. In the case of a row, that's horizontal. That makes the cross-axis horizontal in a column and vertical in a row. And we have multiple options for it. If you take a look, though, it's pretty obvious that center is the option that's by default. Now, notice it's centering it in the column. It is not centering it in the phone. So if we really wanted to do that, we could come over here and let me just wrap this container in a center widget. When I do that and save it, you will see it moves it to the center. Now, there's also an align if you want finer control, and aligning widgets will be a future episode. So let's go back up here to the top and take a look here, and let's go ahead and add in a cross-axis alignment. So cross-axis alignment has start. Well, that's putting it at the beginning. It has end. That is putting it at the end. Now notice it's putting, once again, same thing. It's putting it at the end of the widget, not at the end of the screen. So it will work great for lining stuff up at the end, but you would need to make sure of aligning it some other way if you wanted it to actually be to the far right of the screen. Now let's talk for a second about why we use start and end. Start and end are used because there are languages that are right to left, and that means that the letters go from the right-hand side of the screen to the left-hand side of the screen. So by saying start and end, we don't have to know what language it is to know how to align things up. We can just do it based on that. We said there was no cross-axis size. That's true. But there is cross-axis alignment stretch, and that achieves kind of the same thing. You'll see as a max. That forces it to be as wide as the column will be able to be. It also forces each of the widgets to be the width also. Of course, height for rows. And by doing this, we can make the widget the full width of the screen. However, we've now lost the ability to center or align with the start or the end on the widgets. Each of the widgets will have to align themselves at this point. So it's useful, but be aware of the limitations. The final cross-axis alignment we have is baseline. And that one's a little bit advanced for what we have here, but I'd like to say that first off, it has no effect at all on a column because a baseline is a way to align things in a horizontal space. And so in the case of a column, it'll always just make it start. And what a baseline is if you think about like we're in the English letter G over here, that bottom part of the G goes below the other letters. That's the baseline is the bottom part of the W-I-D-E-T part, but the G goes under it. That's the baseline. And so in a case of a row, cross-axis alignment baseline is a way to cause things to be lined up when the widgets themselves don't always follow that. The next thing that we need to talk about is the main axis alignment. Here are the options we have for main axis alignment. We have start, center, and end, which I'll show you but are pretty obvious. And we have space around, space between, and space evenly. Each of these will evenly space the widgets but differ in how much space there is above and below the first and last widgets. The first thing I should say, though, is the fact that right now we have mainAxisSize to min, and that means that these options would do absolutely nothing, because the only way you can align something or space it around is if what's holding all the widgets is bigger than the widgets themselves. Okay, we could actually just change this to mainAxisSize max, and that would go ahead and do what we want, or I can just delete the line because, of course, that's the default. And once again, when I save, you'll see that it did nothing. So let's go ahead and add an alignment. And for this, I could do center to start with. And you'll see that it centers. One thing I want to point out, though, is that it's centering it in the actual column itself, which is not the phone again, because there's the app bar up at the top. I could do start. I could do end. Now, when I do these, one of the things you might notice is that the main axis alignment space, or the bottom line here, gets cut off a little bit. There is something called safe area you should probably check out. I will cover that in a future episode. However, so start, center, and end work exactly the way we expect them to. The next thing we're going to say is space between. And when we do that, what you will see that it actually just evenly spaces everything. This is a great way to do it instead of specifying how much room there should be between, because this works regardless of the size of the phone, and it will go from the top to the bottom. Now, if I go with space evenly, what you will see is that it goes ahead and it puts space in the top and the bottom. It goes and adds the space on the top and the bottom. And then the final one is space around. And when I do that, what you will see is that it just puts half the space on the top and half the space on the bottom, and the rest of it's evenly in between. So these are great options when you're wanting to do that. However, we may need more control than just even space between everything. So that's where we start talking about the different flex type objects. In order to discuss the customized spacing between items, I created 3 widgets here. Now, I had showed an early version of this video to a friend of mine, and she told me that, well, why are you always using text widgets? Is that all you can do in a column? And of course not. I'm just using them because they are easy to put in here. Flutter provides us something called a spacer. And so I could put a spacer here. And when I save, you will see that it actually, that spacer, because it's the only one, took up all of the space. So that A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens is at the top, and It Was the Best of Times is at the bottom. Well, that's probably not what I want. So I can come down here, and I can add another spacer. And with that, when I save it, you will see that it actually now has got an even amount of space between the two. It put them together. The way it does that is with something called flex. And you add up the total number of flex units that you have, and then each one gets that share of it. So, for example, down here I could say flex 2. And when I do that, you will see that now there's twice the space here that there was there. I could say 3, and that would do that. Okay, so that's how we can do spacers. We actually can just do a flex object and say flex whatever, but spacer is I think the preferred way to do it because I think it reads really well. Now, maybe I want to make one of the widgets itself just take up all the space. Well, in that case, I wouldn't use a spacer for that part. What I would do is I would wrap this with another widget, and I would wrap it with an expanded widget. So that is expanded, and when I do that, it will actually eat up all the available space. Well, it defaults to flex 1, so because I have a spacer here, it actually put half the space here and half the space here. Once again, if we look at the inspector, that's probably the easiest way really to see with these. You'll see that this widget is this big. Here's the spacer that took up this much space, and then this widget itself is now this tall. Where expanded really comes in handy is when I have a column laid out or a row, and I have a widget that maybe it's an image, maybe it's a shape, and I want that widget to take up all of the space that's available, but I don't want it to impose on the items around it or cause an overflow. So we should probably talk about overflows. When I was on the boring show, I had brought along a gist with me, and then this happened. I was mortified. I had created a column that listed all of my buttons on it right here. The problem was I didn't take into account the fact that it might have been taller than the real estate that was available. So we were flipped landscape to show off something else, and we went back to this screen. It showed this bottom overflowed. To protect against this, I could have put the column inside of a single child scroll view, or I could have put all the buttons inside of something like a list view. Those are both more advanced topics we'll talk about later. But what I wanted to point out is the fact that a column or a row can overflow, and if it does, you probably need to rethink how things are being done and or control things separately. What do you think, Dash? I agree. Columns and rows are an important part of our toolkit. While we often have to use other widgets because of overflow or scrolling, we still need to lay things out horizontally and vertically, and that's what the basics are for. I hope you've liked this episode and learned a lot. If so, please consider liking it. Leave a comment. Tell me what you'd like me to do next time. I'd love to have you subscribe to the channel. In the meantime, here's a link to my first episode, the text widget, as well as my boring show.